My name is Tiara. I'm here with the Ancient Forest Alliance. It's nice to see many of you could join us in person. I know many people are also watching from home tonight, so a warm welcome to all of you for joining us at our first live stream event, Ancient Forest Alliance, the future of BC's ancient forests. So a little round of applause for them. Great, thank you. We have a great night ahead of us. And before I jump into the format, I wanted to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded territories of the Lekwungen-speaking people, now also known as the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I'd also like to give great thanks to Sunset Labs and to Stream of Consciousness for helping to facilitate tonight. We're most grateful, so thank you. So we have 4 speakers here tonight. We've got 2 of our own, Ancient Forest Alliance, TJ Watt and Andrea Inness. And we've got 2 guest speakers, Dr. Andy McKinnon and Tyson Atleo. How we'll proceed, each of them is going to come up and give their presentation. And when their presentation concludes, then we'll open the space for a question and answer session. So everybody here tonight will have a chance to pose their questions, and we'll also take some questions from the live stream audience as well. So on that note, our first speaker tonight is going to be TJ Watt. TJ Watt is Ancient Forest Alliance's photographer, co-founder, and our campaigner. And he works to shed light on BC's endangered old-growth forests and in order to protect them. And he's also an avid big tree hunter, often found exploring back roads in BC, and especially on Vancouver Island in search of the last old-growth giants. So he's going to come on and speak to us a bit about the status and characteristics of BC's ancient forests. So please welcome TJ.
Thank you, Tiara. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here tonight. Once again, my name is TJ Watt, campaigner, photographer with the Ancient Forest Alliance, and tonight my talk is going to be on BC's unique and endangered ancient forests. So I'll have to do a little bit of a turn to see the screen here, but I've got 10 minutes to describe to you all about one of the most beautiful and charismatic landscapes on all of planet Earth, second really only in grandeur to the redwoods of California. And right here in our own backyard, we have some of the most amazing trees on planet Earth, trees like the San Juan spruce or the Red Creek fir near Port Renfrew. This is the world's largest Douglas fir tree, grows over 23 stories tall. Or the Chihuahua giant, Canada's largest tree and the world's largest western red cedar, has a wood volume equivalent to about 450 regular-sized trees, likely many thousands of years old. And Vancouver Island would have once been covered with forests like this. If you look at a map here depicting the original extent of old-growth forests across Vancouver Island and the southwest mainland, the dark green represents the original productive old-growth forest, forests that you imagine when someone says old-growth. Fast forward after over a century of logging, and it's a dire situation where we've lost about 80% of the original productive old-growth forests, including over 90% of the valley bottoms where the biggest trees grow and the richest biodiversity resides. And if you zoom into southern Vancouver Island, the contrast is even more striking, where we've lost 96% of those valley bottom ancient forests. And somehow the government will still try to contend that these forests are not endangered. About 12% of Vancouver Island is protected, but that only equates to about 6% of that original dark green productive old growth that once covered the island. And the reason being is that a lot of the protected areas favor locations that have a lot of rock and ice, like some parts of Strathcona in central Vancouver Island, or the low productivity old growth forests, like those that are found in the coastal bog environments or the subalpine areas where trees are stunted due to the harsh growing conditions. So these are still old growth forests, but they're not commercially valuable. What the industry is after and what's underrepresented in our park system are the productive old growth forests with trees like this one. This photo was just taken a month ago, in the Kaikous watershed outside of Lake Cowichan, in a forest that I had hiked while it was still standing not long before that. So people often ask, well, if you plant trees and they grow back, then what's the issue? This is a renewable resource. There's no problem here. But the question is it's not really a tree issue. It's an ecosystem issue. And the question should be, are these second growth forests adequately replicating the old growth forests that they're replacing? The answer is they aren't. They're drastically different environments. On the top, you can see an old growth forest, a forest that has trees from a day old to 1,000 years old. And when those big trees get old and fall down, they create gaps in the canopy. This lets light into the forest floor, creating a much more luxuriant understory and creating these large logs on the ground and woody debris, providing habitat for many species. In stark contrast to the second growth on the bottom, where all the trees are about the same age, all of them are alive. The closed canopy creates much more shaded environment with less food and shelter for plants and animals that would call this forest home. But we know that old growth is important for many, many reasons, one of which is the multi-billion-dollar tourism industry that it supports. Places like the Avatar Grove near Port Renfrew are drawing in visitors from all across the globe who come to marvel at these ancient giants. And it's helped us build allies in unlikely places as well, like with the Port Renfrew Chamber of Commerce. You can see the chamber president here sporting the gnarly tree right on the side of his truck. And this town has now branded itself as a tall trees capital of Canada and is an incredible example of how leaving old growth forest standing can be good for the economy as well. Old growth forests are also important for many threatened and endangered species, such as the marble murrelet here. This is a seabird that nests on the wide mossy limbs of these old growth trees. Old growth is also important habitat for creatures like the spotted owl or the mountain caribou in the interior, both of which face extinction due to old growth logging in their critical habitat. You also sometimes find the coastal tree climbers nesting high up in the canopy of these trees. Important habitat for them as well. And old growth is important for clean water and wild salmon, which are also in a crisis at this moment, and for the global fight against runaway climate change. These are some of the best carbon storehouses on planet Earth, and in fact, old growth forests store 2 to 3 times more carbon per hectare than the second growth forests that are replacing them. And also old growth forests are very important for many First Nations cultures whose unceded lands these are and whose cultures evolved and learned to thrive in old growth while leaving them standing. So here's a map noting some of the areas of ecological interest on Vancouver Island, sometimes referred to as hotspots. These are areas of high conservation and ecological value, and that we're asking the government to place a moratorium on logging in those regions. I don't have time, unfortunately, to highlight them all, but I'll show you a few of the ones that we've been to. First would be Edinburgh Mountain near Port Renfrew. This is one of my favorite places on planet Earth. It's one of the largest contiguous tracts of unprotected old growth left on southern Vancouver Island, home to the magnificent Eden Grove and the wildlife that also lives there, like this black bear we caught climbing a tree. But year after year, clear cuts by Teal Jones are chipping away at this intact jewel of nature. And forests that I've come to grow and love, I return later to find those very trees gone and cut down. And this must stop. Just north of there is the Central Walbrand Valley, also in the Pacheedaht territory. It's here where you find some of the most grandest remaining ancient stands of old growth red cedars in the entire country. Like this giant here, a 17-foot wide cedar in the Upper Castle Grove. Now this tree was actually one of the 54 trees that the government protected this past year, 54 out of the entire province. We're grateful for that, but that of course leaves thousands of other giants like this vulnerable to being cut down in this valley at this time. The McKelvey Valley near Tassis has been another area that we've been working to highlight. This is the last intact watershed unprotected in the Tassis region. It's home to McKelvey Creek with these incredible crystal clear blue water flowing through. This is the drinking water supply of Tassis and provides clean water for spawning salmon in the region. Unfortunately, Western Forest Products has plans to punch a road right into this valley, creating upwards of 25 clear cuts if it was to go ahead. But the mayor and council and the majority of the community members are on board in protecting this area and other areas and emulating the success of Port Renfrew in the idea of big tree ecotourism and reinventing this town. And we're going to be there to back them. There's also the Namint Valley near Port Alberni in the territories of the Hooperchesset and Seashat First Nation. Just an incredible place. If you haven't been there, I can't recommend going there enough. One of the most unbelievable recreational spots on Vancouver Island with these beautiful blue waters. It was here in May 2018 that we came across this Douglas fir, an enormous one. It actually turned out to be the 9th widest in British Columbia. Well, we returned a few weeks later, and this is what we found. This is in a BC Timber Sales cut block. BC Timber Sales is the BC government's own logging agency that is auctioning off hundreds and hundreds of hectares of the finest remaining old-growth forests in this valley. And over again, we're coming across these timeless, irreplaceable landscapes to find them gone, destroyed in a matter of minutes. And viewscapes like this one from the Namint Lake Campground, where people come to camp, marred with clear cuts, again, by BC Timber Sales. And it's not just Vancouver Island. This extends to, across BC to places like the inland temperate rainforest near Prince George. This is a place called the Parthenon Grove, one of the most beautiful forests I've ever been in. These ancient cedars covered with these golden lichens. But even here, the telltale signs of logging follow them. But we're told that this is the world's best logging practices. There's nothing to worry about. Old-growth forests are not endangered. Tell me if you think this is part of the world's best logging practices. Where once lush green ancient forests in the Klanawa Valley are turned to a black and white moonscape with charred stumps. And stumps like this one, the trees that have to be over 1,000 years old that will never be seen again in our lifetime or many other people's lifetimes. And it can be hard taking this all in, especially in the light of what we're facing on a global scale with climate change and the loss of these forests. It can be hard to keep going. But we need to remember what inspires us and return to these places that give us energy and give us hope. Places like the Avatar Grove that is still standing today because thousands of British Columbians made their voices heard and stood up even when they were told no, and eventually it was successfully protected for all of us to enjoy. And together, we need to ensure that our children and their children will be able to look up at the same stars, see the same trees towering overhead as they have for thousands of years. And the people who will be coming up after me will explain just how we plan to do that. Thank you.
All right, thank you, TJ. Our next speaker tonight is going to be Dr. Andy McKinnon. Andy is a forest ecologist from Metchosin, where he also serves as a municipal councillor since 2014. In 2017, he ran as a Green Party candidate for the Metchosin Esquimalt riding. And before retiring in 2015, he worked for the BC Forest Service for 30 years, mostly on the coast, where he's now known for his deep knowledge of old-growth ecology in BC. Andy also likes to share his knowledge. He teaches here on the coast and as well on the mainland at SFU. And we all know, or at least many of us know, that he's a very fun guy who especially loves mushroom season. And as well, he's the co-author of 6 popular plant guide books, identifying species in Western North America. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Andy McKinnon.
Thank you so much, Tiara. Boy, I sure hate following TJ Watt. It's a difficult place to be. I'm going to move from a discussion on why these forests are critically important to talk a little bit about their current status, projections about the future, and so forth. Because we've had groups as diverse as the BC Chambers of Commerce, those notorious tree huggers, the Union of British Columbia Municipalities, and vast numbers of British Columbians calling for reform in how we manage old growth forests. And because not much has changed, there's really not much difference in forest management between our current government and the liberal government that preceded them. It strikes me that we're in a very absurd situation nowadays. And so fortunately, I received my copy of the autumn issue of Trucklogger magazine in the mail today. And the lead article is on old growth forests. So I thought I'd start with a bit of a strange quote from the article on old growth forests from the issue of Trucklogger magazine that came out today. If you're not a subscriber, it's a wonderful magazine. Here we go. Best accumulative figures available suggest old growth management hectares stands rival Greece's total arable land base, while current estimates of old growth hectares of all protected areas in British Columbia are about the size of Hungary's agricultural land base. So there you go. In case TJ's numbers didn't help you, it's the same as Hungary's agricultural land base. Andrea asked me if I would address these topics. It's basically the world and everything that's in it in about 10 minutes. So I'm going to very quickly, and there will be time for questions at the end, describe the likely future under a business as usual approach. That is, if we're going to log to the end of the old growth. What are the values that are at risk? What are some of the current and predicted future impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss? What will happen to BC's forest sector if we don't change course? How are jobs and communities likely to be affected? What's already working? And the 2017 NDP election platform and how that relates to all of this. So, I think we better go quickly here. The likely future under a business as usual scenario is very much dependent on where you live in the province. And that's because protected areas, and in many cases forest management practices, are dictated as part of regional land use plans. These are British Columbia's regional land use plans. The vast majority of them were produced in the 1990s up into the early aughts, at which time the government believed that the correct answer to how much protected areas should you have in a region was 12%. And so almost every land use plan in the province has just about 12% protected areas. And that doesn't mean 12% protected old growth, as TJ eloquently explained. On Vancouver Island, for example, the Vancouver Island Land Use Plan is one of those plans with 12% protected areas. And it began with existing protected areas. And if you were trying to draw a tighter line around all of the subalpine and alpine on Vancouver Island than the Strathcona boundaries, I'd be amazed. So we protected over 97% of the area above tree line on Vancouver Island, at the same time that we've protected, of course, less than a tenth of that for productive old growth forest. The exceptions here are the last land use plans that were done for Haida Gwaii, which is about 52% protected areas, Great Bear Rainforest, which is 75 to 85% protected areas. And one of the earlier ones done, which is actually a portion of Vancouver Island, which is the Clayoquot Sound Land Use Plan, which is not part of the Vancouver Island Land Use Plan, and actually has about a third protected areas. And it's been my great good fortune to be involved with all of these three. It's interesting the answers that people come up with about the amount of the land base you want protected in your region if they're not told that the correct answer is 12%. So the future of old growth is very much dependent on where you happen to be in the province. So what are the values that are at risk? I think everybody here has their own values associated with old growth forests. I've listed a few of the ecological, social, and economic values. I included in social a few that might not be familiar to people. The ideas of that the social scientists were helping us with as we were developing an old growth strategy for the province in the early 1990s. The ideas of option, That is, that future generations can have some say in what happens to the forests in British Columbia. Obviously, future generations aren't going to have much say in what happens to old-growth forests on southern Vancouver Island anymore. That option's gone. Bequest the importance, and I think this is important for a lot of people I talk to, especially when you get older, like me, the idea that you're actually going to be leaving something for future generations, including for some of us, children and grandchildren. And existence, the idea that even if you never get to some of these magnificent places that people like TJ are exploring, that it's really important for a lot of people to just know that they're there. And in addition to the social, economic, and ecological values, I've spent much of my research career documenting ecological values of old-growth forests. In addition to these, I've added the concept of irreplaceability. You'll oftentimes read in government literature that BC practices sustainable resource management. And I always like to go out of my way to remind them there's nothing sustainable about logging old-growth forests. There's no intent to ever restore them, and we probably couldn't even if we wanted to. So you can't say that you're practicing sustainable resource management in a province where you're still logging your old-growth forests. Okay, what are some of the current and predicted future impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss? I had to write all these down because I was thinking I was going to be able to work from my slides, but I can't quite see them from here. And I won't go into it in any great detail, but it will change very much depending on which ecosystem you're dealing with. This is a map of British Columbia's ecological regions. There are more types of forests in British Columbia than there are in the rest of Canada combined. There are more types of ecosystems in British Columbia, more types of species in any groups of organisms that you can think of in British Columbia than there is in the rest of Canada combined. So it's the most ecologically and species-rich place in Canada, which kind of implies a little bit greater responsibility on behalf of the people in British Columbia. Because of this, the effects of climate change are going to be much more varied than they're going to be anywhere else in Canada. There'll be the effects on the ecosystems and the effects on species. It has been getting warmer over most of the province. Our mean temperatures now are about 1 degree warmer than they were about 30 years ago. So climate change isn't something that's going to happen, it's something that's happening. The tree lines, the elevation of alpine, the tree line has been increasing in elevation over all of British Columbia and over the southern interior British Columbia because we have less than 100 meters between the top of the forest and the top of most mountains. We're going to lose more than 90% of our alpine habitats in southern British Columbia in the next 50 years. And there's a whole bunch of species that we know in British Columbia only from the alpine. So the effects are going to be really important. It's going to get wetter in some seasons, drier in others. The predictions about precipitation are a lot less robust than the predictions about temperature. I've just added a couple of notes here. We are going to probably certainly have already lost species from the province and perhaps from planet Earth before we've known of their existence. There has been canopy research in British Columbia documenting the canopy arthropods and lichens in our old-growth forests. A lot of them are known in Canada, some of them in the world, only from those 3 trees that have been looked at in detail in British Columbia. Assuming we had the same sorts of endemism, species occurring only in the old-growth forests on southeastern Vancouver Island, any species that were endemic in that area are now extinct. But we'll never know, which to me is a bit of a frightening concept. The other thing that I'd just like to mention about climate change is that things will happen that we don't expect. It's really nice to have the old-growth forests out there just as a baseline. An example of this is yellow cedar decline. I've worked all up and down the coast, and it was first noticed in southeast Alaska that a warming climate is actually leading to the death of vast areas of yellow cedar forests. What's happening with and it's happening, as it turns out, because the roots of the shallow-rooted yellow cedar are freezing. So a warmer climate is leading to the death of trees by freezing. And that's because it's reducing the snowpack that insulates the shallow roots of the yellow cedar. It's not something that anybody could have expected. It's not something that anybody could have predicted. And so there's going to be all kinds of effects of climate change that are going to be very difficult to predict. Okay, what will happen to BC's forest sector if we don't change course? How are jobs and communities likely to be affected? Well, that could be another evening's talk, perhaps. But anybody who's been following the news has noticed all of the layoffs, all the mill closures that have been happening. For me, as a retired professional forester, it's tragic. I would argue that here in British Columbia, we have perhaps the greatest forest resource on planet Earth. It's 94% publicly owned. It's a huge area of magnificent forest, including a lot of the world's largest trees, and certainly more diversity than you'd find in any similar area at temperate latitudes globally. And we're just getting fewer and fewer returns in terms of jobs, revenue, any other measure you could look at. If we compare 1997 with 2016, and we look at the percentage of provincial GDP, direct employment, or forest revenue, you can see that they've all fallen hugely over this period of time. The only thing that hasn't fallen very much is the amount of wood that we cut each year. If we were getting the same number of jobs per cubic meter cut as Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, Washington, or Oregon, we'd be employing twice as many people. So it's a desperate situation in British Columbia. This is a picture that was taken 2 weeks ago when I was at the Union of British Columbia Municipality meetings in Vancouver. I'm a counselor in Metchosin, as Tiara mentioned, and so I was at these meetings, and 400 logging trucks made their way down from central interior British Columbia. The effects of our management and policies are obviously particularly profound for people in a lot of small communities throughout the central and northern interior of the province, and they were there in Vancouver to let us know about that. What's already working? Just showing this one more time so that we can look at the areas labeled Central and North Coast on that map, which are referred to more commonly as the Great Bear Rainforest, and on Haida, Gwaii, where land use plans were developed with a huge amount of community input and without any kind of arbitrary and artificial caps put on them. And people are reinventing forest management and community benefits in these areas. It's a huge experiment. In these areas, it's being managed government to government, with the provincial government and First Nations as equal partners, both with a veto. Or in the case of Great Bear Rainforest, government to government to government to government to government to government, because there's a lot of First Nations in that area. And they're starting from some different premises, and they're evaluating all management options in terms of the benefits to the ecosystems, to the people, to the communities. So there are areas you can point to in British Columbia where people are taking a close look at our management of forests, including our management of old-growth forests, and Tyson Atleo is going to talk a little bit more about that in a very specific and very beautiful part of the world later on today. So there are areas where it's going to be working, where it has been working, and that's where we come back to promises in the last provincial election from the new Democratic Party government, who recognized that there were new and exciting and productive things that were happening in areas like the Great Bear Rainforest, and that these were the sort of land use plans that represented the future for the people of British Columbia and for the forests of British Columbia. And they promised that they were going to be developing similar plans in other parts of the province that would presumably yield these same sorts of benefits in other sorts of the provinces. We haven't seen anything from them yet. But of course, one must remain optimistic. And we hope that this is the sort of thing that we're going to see from our provincial government over the next little while. But I think I've gone more than 10 minutes now, so I'll pass the mic back.
Great. All right. Well, we're on to our third speaker tonight, Tyson Atleo. Tyson is a representative for the Ahousaht Hereditary Chiefs, and he is a hereditary chief in line for the Ahousaht Nation. He also serves as the economic development lead for the Nature Conservancy. In his role with the Nature Conservancy, he works to advance community-focused conservation and development strategies, with a large focus on coastal rainforests here in Canada, as well as other geographies, both in Canada and abroad. In his role for his nation, he served 4 years as the youngest elected councillor in Ahousaht history. And he has and continues to serve in many important roles, prioritizing Indigenous-led community development, engagement, and conservation. This includes being the Vice President of the Ahousaht Stewardship and Sustainable Economic Development Corporation and co-founding the Gathering Voices Society. So welcome, Tyson.
Thank you very much. Do I have to click as well? Perfect. All right, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you to my colleagues who are going to be presenting here this evening, Andrea, and I have to say it was an amazing presentation, TJ. That was really well done. It's like you've practiced that or done that before. And it's always a pleasure to be able to speak alongside Dr. McKinnon. It's truly an honor to be able to do that. I really respect and admire you, so thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to support this work and to sit down with you all and have this conversation. I'm based here in Victoria right now, and it's always a pleasure to be able to work and enjoy life on the Songhees and Esquimalt territories, especially in this Inner Harbor area where we know they were displaced, of course, once upon a time to allow this city to grow, and it is what it is today. But it's nice to be here. I'm going to share a little bit about our experience in Clayoquot Sound with the Ahousaht First Nation, as well as some experience that I have with the Nature Conservancy working with Indigenous peoples on conservation efforts around the world. I'm less prepared, I guess, but I wanted to walk you through something different than what my colleagues have provided here. So I know that they're going to share a little bit about old growth harvesting and the dangers of over-harvesting and what clear cuts look like and forest ecology and things that I'm not an expert in. What I wanted to share with you is a Nuu-chah-nulth or an Ahousaht cultural perspective with regard to old growth rainforests and to conservation, and follow that up with a discussion about our current experience. And so I think Dr. McKinnon's last slide talking about what was promised by the NDP following the Great Bear, we're currently living that example, and so I can share with you what we're currently up to and how that process is working. So this is a still image from a video I did with a group where I remember the line from this image. It was on video, and it basically said, growing up, my grandfather, one of the first things he taught me that I can remember was how to talk to trees. And so it can seem wild and outlandish that that's something that somebody would teach a young person, but it's very much an important part of our culture, this relationship that we have with the natural environment, recognizing each of these trees as individual beings. They provide for us. We're a cedar and salmon people as Nuu-chah-nulth people. So we have to acknowledge that. Every time we go out into the bush, every time we harvest, it takes care of us, and that's how we live our life. And so the journey for the Clayoquot Sound project really started from the authority of our chiefs. And so we see some of our hereditary chiefs represented here. For the Hausat people, we still have very much an intact hereditary governance system. It comes from a culture that's been around for thousands and thousands of years and is based on a set of laws and principles. And so what I've spent a lot of time doing is trying to understand those laws and principles and where they come from. And so I've spent time with my grandfather and my father, Dr. Umik Richard Atleo on the left, and my father, Awenchut Sean Atleo, former National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations. And I have spent a lot of time in our territories talking about our culture and our spirituality and our role as leaders in our communities and our role as human beings on this planet. And recently I spent time with my grandfather at his house talking about the origin of law and where that comes from for us as Nuu-chah-nulth people. And it comes, of course, from the spiritual, from the metaphysical realm, from a place that isn't exactly based in reality, which to the scientists might be like, hey, where are you going with that? But for us, it's a very important part of our life, because that's where we get our knowledge from about how to be good human beings on this planet. And then the spiritual manifests in reality as what we see, touch, smell, hear, feel around us. So that's where it comes from. That's where our lessons about how to behave on this planet come from for the Nuu-chah-nulth people. They come from that place, from the spiritual place, which gives birth to the reality that we see ourselves in today. So that's what I talked with my grandfather about the origin of law. Where does it come from? How do we access it? And it's by interacting with that natural environment through ceremony. And we all have our ceremonies. This is something that belongs to all human beings, not just Nuu-chah-nulth people. We all have access to that place. Every human society and culture comes from that understanding, that we rely on the natural world to feed us, to provide for us, to clothe us, and so on and so forth. And then in taking care of it, that's our responsibility. That is our arguably niche in this world, is to take care of the ecosystems around us so that they can continue to provide for all of the beings within that system in perpetuity. Another really interesting family experience that I've had recently is with my father, talking about this idea of unconscious consciousness. And so the image of the totem is to represent a kind of a continuum of ideas, that where we started from as human beings was a place of unconscious competence, where it was relatively instinctual that we were able to interact with the natural world. We understood how to behave in that place. We understood what takes care of us and how we take care of it. Unfortunately, what we've moved to is a situation where we are unconsciously incompetent. We don't know how we are harming the world, and thus how we are harming ourselves in the process. But what we need to work towards is a conscious incompetence, where we're aware of the problems that we've created for ourselves and for other beings and how we interact with those other beings in this world. And then hopefully from an conscious incompetence, we can move to a conscious competence, where we're actually making change. We're doing things for the better. We've figured out that we're the problem and are trying to correct ourselves so that we can get back to that blissful space of being unconsciously competent, where it's just natural, it's reactive. We know what we're doing. We're fitting into the society. We're fitting into the broader society that includes all beings around us. Stories like Nuu-chah-nulth Man and Bear are where we get this knowledge from, observing the natural world. So the quick story of Nuu-chah-nulth Man and Bear is very simple. Nuu-chah-nulth Man had a fish trap in the river, and that fish trap spanned the river and thus caught every salmon heading up the river. So Nuu-chah-nulth Man went to check his trap, and it was busted, it was broken, it was dismantled, and everything was strewn everywhere. Nuu-chah-nulth Man couldn't understand why, so he slept by the river. And lo and behold, Bear came along, and he witnessed Bear break his trap. He said, "Why are you doing this to me? I have a family to feed. I have to take these fish home to feed my people." And Bear said, "Come with me and I'll show you." And so Nuu-chah-nulth Man hopped on Bear's back and went over 4 mountains. And when they got to Bear's village, they entered the village and Bear took off his skin. And what he saw at that time, Nuu-chah-nulth Man, was a reflection of himself, that they're just like us. They're the same as us. And so entering the village, he entered into an accord or an agreement with Bear's people, acknowledging them as people and saying, "Yes, I understand, you're the same as us. So thus we need to provide for each other. And I won't take all those fish from the river. I will build my trap in a different way that provides for your family as well." And so that recognition of once taking off our skins, that we're the same, that we're the same as that cedar, that we're the same as that bear, is a really important part of our culture. And it's something, again, that we can return to an understanding of. It's a valuing and acknowledging the values of others, the inherent values that other beings provide for us and beyond. And so shifting quickly to indigenous conservation and why indigenous conservation. It's scientifically proven that in indigenous area or indigenous protected or indigenous controlled lands that biodiversity is higher, that protection is greater, management is stronger, etc. And so indigenous-led protection is something that the Nature Conservancy really takes very seriously, and something that we do aggressively here in Canada, and is what I'll share with you an example of. That in working with indigenous peoples as partners, we can realize some of these conservation outcomes that we're all desperate for in an era of climate change and beyond. It's something that we can partner with indigenous peoples to achieve. Because it's those principles and values that come from our culture, that come from the story of bear, that come from our spiritual practices. We still have those intact cultures that are deeply connected to the land, to the marine spaces. And it's there where we can draw on that knowledge to inform better management decision-making processes. But you can't do that without genuine collaboration and partnership. And so that's what this is all about. That around the world, we're starting to recognize that these indigenous ways of knowing are in fact valuable and can inform decision-making processes. Unfortunately, we're a little slow to pick that up here in Canada, but hopefully the pace is quickening. Clayoquot Sound is an example, and Dr. McKinnon actually mentioned that there is a history in Clayoquot Sound of watershed planning, this Clayoquot Sound scientific panel. My grandfather was the co-chair on that panel. And what it did is it set out to identify areas that were to be preserved from harvest activity, specifically around watershed boundaries to preserve intact streams to allow for salmon and other ecological benefits. Now this is of course post significant harvest in Clayoquot Sound, but it was a step in the right direction. What we're trying to do now is take that a step even further because it's not good enough for us today. So this is an image of Clayoquot Sound, and everything that you can see that isn't green is on the harvestable land base. So it exists within tree farm licenses or timber supply areas, 3 tenures in specific. And so that's what it looks like today. So if you've been to Tofino and you look out onto the land base, you can see where Tofino is there, kind of in the lower left quadrant, that everything around you is harvestable. Now, of course, we do have the Clayoquot Sound watershed plans that restrict harvesting in areas that are visible and things like that and around stream bases, but there is a lot of harvest potential here. Tens of thousands of cubic meters a year. And it's just not good enough for the Ahousa people. We don't get any benefit from it, first of all. And so, as a result of the Great Bear Agreements, the Ahousa chiefs invited the Nature Conservancy, who I now work for, to come to Clayoquot Sound and work with us on building a similar vision. And so we started with building that vision by engaging the community and understanding how the community wanted to see their future in that place, how we wanted to secure this place for our future based on our cultural principles and values. And so the vision actually came out looking very different, principally green, of course, where we have cultural and natural areas that we're preserving for cultural purposes, spiritual practice, but of course for carbon and for other economic opportunities as well. And so what came from an invitation from the chiefs and the authority of the chiefs developed into this partnership where we're working together to realize this vision of the Ahousa people, which of course balances conservation outcomes that we're also desperate for, but also ensuring the security, the economic security and cultural security of the Ahousa and Clayoquot Sound region into the long-term future. And so this is what we're working on today. So post-Great Bear, where are there other First Nations and organizations working on land use plans that reflect good conservation values and strong management outcomes, good partnerships with Indigenous people? Absolutely in Clayoquot Sound. This is a prime example. This vision was made public in 2016, and we're definitely still working on it very aggressively. And so it started with a community visioning process where people were able to articulate who they wanted to be in this landscape, what they wanted it to look like, and how it might benefit them. And what we've moved through is a series of practices of implementation strategies. And what we're running up against, of course, is policy. We're running up against, this isn't where BC wants to go with this work right now. And so we're continuously challenged by policy and practice in BC around forest management, and it's kind of like bashing your head against the wall over and over again. You don't seem to get anywhere. Fortunately, in Fortunately, through some of our really good work with our partners at the Nature Conservancy and other NGOs and so on, we have made some strides recently. And in August, Catherine McKenna, our Canadian Minister for the Environment and Climate Change, announced support for the Haida and colloquiate land use visions in Clayoquot Sound. Now, what that's resulted in is a little bit of political impetus that gives us some momentum to drive this work forward, but we certainly do not have a champion. You know, the champion that we have on our side are our colleagues in the in environmental NGOs, and like the Nature Conservancy, like the Sierra Club, etc. But it's just not enough. You know, we need the support of people more broadly to get this work done, and we of course need support from the British Columbia government. But it's live work, despite there being a significant amount of barriers to achieving this vision. But we're going to continue to do it with the support of our colleagues and the support of our partners, and of course with your support. And so what can we do about this? I often get asked at presentations, like, what can the average individual do about this who is not connected, who doesn't live in the territories? There's so much we can do about it. Incredible amounts of things. You know, we can vote effectively, right? That's obviously one big thing that we're all going to be responsible for very shortly here. We can be truly collaborative with our work. We can be genuinely interested in engaging and building partnerships with one another. And oftentimes in true partnerships and in true collaboration, you need to give up some of your power and control and allow others to step into the space and allow others' visions to move forward. And that's something that I've seen be very successful in this work. We can inspire young people, of course. It's actually very nice to see some young people in the audience today. I hope we're not boring you too much, and that these messages resonate for you, and that you know that there are people out there working hard for your future. So I hope that is coming across today. It's important that that's, of course, where we focus, because it's the next generation that's going to take responsibility for these places. We know that as Indigenous people, that 7 generations down the line and so on, we need to cast into the future how we want to manage today, and that's what we need to be encouraging our governments to do. That's what we need to be encouraging all of our partners to do out there. So that's what's going on right now. We're actively trying to change forest management practices in partnership with Indigenous peoples and NGOs in British Columbia, and we don't have a tremendous amount of traction, and we need that traction. We want to get this work done, and it's going to get done. It's just slow, and we just don't have the luxury of time. And so we need to accelerate the work, we need to be bold, we need to take risks, we need to be aggressive, because these things obviously don't last. Those images from TJ were so powerful, where you were there weeks before things were cut down. We can't tolerate that any longer. And best practice in terms of building partnerships and running strategies can only go so far, and oftentimes you just got to get up and get out and connect with one another and create some noise. So I'm happy to be here to chat about our experience, but really happy to be here to support the work that you are all doing as well, and commend you all for coming out tonight and everyone that's joined online. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Tyson. For our last speaker of this evening, we have Ancient Forests Alliance campaigner Andrea Inness. Andrea has been with AFA since 2017, but she has been long since dedicated to protecting BC's outstanding and endangered landscapes. She has a wealth of experience working in governmental and non-governmental organizations, both in Canada and in Australia, and has been involved with a number of environmental groups as well, including Canadian Parks and Wilderness Society's BC chapter. She has a great love for BC's endangered old growth forests, an incredibly hard worker. She's here tonight to tell you a little bit more about some policy changes and actions that we can all take to protect BC's endangered forests. Please welcome Andrea.
Juggling a few things here. Good evening, and thank you so much for everyone in the room and joining us online, for being with us this evening. And thank you so much to TJ, Andy, and Tyson for your excellent presentations. You're all very tough acts to follow. I'm gonna skip ahead here. This is a lovely image to hover on, but unfortunately I have to skip to this one. If you're concerned about the fate of old growth forests in British Columbia, like we are, then you probably welcomed the election in 2017 of an NDP government and a governing alliance with the BC Green Party, and probably, just like us, had high hopes for action on old growth forests. That was probably because in their 2017 election platform, the NDP government promised, as Andy pointed out, to use the ecosystem-based management approach of the Great Bear Rainforest to manage old growth forests across British Columbia. This is significant because 85% of the forest in that region was protected under that science-based plan. The NDP government also promised to work with First Nations to modernize land use planning to sustainably manage old growth forests. And the BC Green Party has long been calling for an end to old growth logging in British Columbia. After the BC government was elected, my Ancient Forest Alliance, along with Sierra Club BC, Wilderness Committee, and Dr. Andy McKinnon, presented the Forest Minister with a series of policy recommendations on how the BC government can protect endangered old growth forests and ensure a sustainable, value-added second growth forest industry. The most important policy recommendation that we made was not a policy recommendation. It was a comprehensive, science-based legislative plan to protect endangered old growth forests, similar to the ecosystem-based management approach of the Great Bear Rainforest. Since the election, the BC government has followed through with some funding for modernizing land use plans in partnership with First Nation. However, it's not nearly enough money in order to start significantly dealing with the very complex and widespread land use planning or land use problems in this province. And it's also not coupled with funding for the sustainable development and diversification of First Nations economies, meaning that there is a risk that modernized land use plans will just further entrench old growth forest logging. The government also in July promised to protect a whopping 54 of BC's biggest trees across the province with 1 hectare buffer zones. Now, my organization, Ancient Forest Alliance, has for years, about 8 years now, been trying to convince the BC government to create a robust, province-wide big tree protection order to recognize the importance of the biggest trees in the province. And so, you know, this is a minuscule step in the right direction, but we need to go so much further. By and large, for the last 2.5 years, the BC government has dragged its heels and has continued the status quo liquidation of our old growth forests in British Columbia. And even when they're presented with opportunities to do the right thing, to address the destructive forest practices in this province, and to increase the public trust, they decide to bury their heads in the sand. Even just earlier this week, we actually exposed BC Timber Sales non-compliance in the Namint Valley. This has been in the news lately this week. BC Timber Sales is failing to meet up to legally binding land use objectives for the Namint Valley, the same valley where we witnessed the logging of some of Earth's grandest trees and oldest, most beautiful trees just over a year ago. But rather than doing the right thing, the BC government is continuing to allow old growth logging to happen in the Namint Valley as we speak. They have directed their compliance and enforcement branch, which did the investigation into logging practices. They've directed them to no longer investigate BC Timber Sales. And what's more, they're allowing another 600 hectares of old growth forest to be logged in the Namint Valley in the coming years. So there's absolutely just no willingness to do the right thing when there is such an obvious need. Time is really running out for places like the Namint Valley and other old growth hotspots of high conservation, recreation, and cultural value. They're disappearing before our eyes, as TJ pointed out. This is the Edinburgh Mountain that TJ mentioned earlier, that largest tract of intact old growth forest on southern Vancouver Island. This is a new road that was punched through just about last year. Now this is all a clear cut. We also have we have a crisis in our forestry sector as well. Dozens of mills have either closed or curtailed their operation in recent months, affecting thousands of forestry jobs. And industry will tell us that it's because of record-breaking wildfires, and it's because of pine beetle epidemics. Well, sure, but the fundamental reason for the BC industry, forest industry's woes at the moment is the short-sighted liquidation of BC's highest value old growth stands. It's also the expanded export of unprocessed logs to foreign mills, and it's the inability of the BC government to plan for the future and to help the industry transition to a sustainable second growth industry. We need to have an economic plan in this forestry sector that sustains jobs while old growth forests logging is phased out. The crisis in the sector right now is actually bringing a unique opportunity for the BC government to invest in retraining and also to diversify forest-based communities. And so my organization, the Ancient Forest Alliance, is calling for the BC government to use regulations and incentives to help expedite the transition to a sustainable, value-added second growth forest industry. We also have this little thing right now called the global climate crisis. I don't know if you've heard of this. The global climate movement is bringing much needed attention to the urgent need for nature-based conservation solutions. So nature-based solutions for climate change. Here in the Pacific Northwest of North America, we have the most carbon-rich forests anywhere else on Earth, and yet we are still logging them. We cannot avoid runaway climate change without protecting these and other other carbon storehouses. But there is some hope. About a year and a half ago, the federal government committed $1.3 billion to meeting the Aichi target. The Aichi target is under the Convention of Biological Diversity, and it calls for the countries that signed on to protect 17% of their lands and inland waters by the end of 2020. That fund also includes $500 million for the protection of lands through purchasing private lands and also creating indigenous protected areas. And because we're on the federal government is on the campaign trail at the moment, it's time for making promises. So a couple weeks ago, the federal government promised to set a new target for protected areas. They are now promising to protect 25% of both in the terrestrial and marine ecosystems by 2025. But we have a long way to go. Scientific evidence tells us that we need to protect 30 to 70% of our ecosystems if we're going to maintain biodiversity and safeguard our own well-being. There's an opportunity and a risk right now with this federal election. So are we going to have more money committed to reaching ambitious targets for protected areas in Canada? Or are those targets going to disappear, and is money going to dry up under a Conservative government? No matter what happens with the federal election, the BC government needs to bring money and support to the table for increasing protected areas. In order for protected areas to be just and sustainable, old growth solutions need to elevate and incorporate and build upon the political and legal authority of First Nations, as well as Indigenous laws and values. So we are calling on the BC government to incorporate old growth forest protection in modernized land use plans and to recognize and formally recognize and support Indigenous protected areas like tribal parks, like this one in Clayoquot Sound. And of course, as Tyson pointed out, there is an incredible opportunity right now in Clayoquot. The federal government has come to the table willing to support conservation solutions and land use planning there, but where is the BC government? They have been silent. Across BC, First Nations communities deserve to have the opportunity to protect ancient forests in their territories without sacrificing economic well-being. And so we're also calling for conservation solutions for First Nations across BC, similar to the $120 million that was committed in the Great Bear Rainforest for conservation and community well-being for the First Nations there. But we also still need a science-based plan for endangered old-growth forests. In June, the BC government sought feedback from British Columbians on 2020 amendments to the Forest and Range Practices Act. This is the main piece of legislation governing forest practices in BC. Environmental groups like ours and thousands of individuals submitted feedback to this process. And not 2 days after the consultation was finished, the BC government announced that they would be convening a 2-person panel this fall to consult on old growth and make recommendations for a new old growth management plan in the new year. So, but there's no timeline associated with this, no intention paper involved, no direction that we're aware of. So we're going from process to process to process, and meanwhile, forests are falling. This is a classic talk and log scenario. So while an old growth forest panel sounds hopeful, so far the province has completely failed to acknowledge the crisis in our forests or indicate that that the solutions that they're considering are appropriate and match the urgency of the issue. So more than any time before, we need British Columbians to speak up, to send messages, share information, and pressure the BC government to take action on old growth. And while longer-term solutions are developed, the government has to do much more than protect 54 trees. As I mentioned, these old growth hotspots that TJ showed on that map earlier are falling before our eyes. We need moratoria on logging in these old growth hotspots. Otherwise, as the government works on creating its strategy, there may be nothing left or very little left by the time they're done and ready to implement whatever strategy they have. So it's too soon at this point to know really what the government's plans are and whether they'll lead to a robust science-based legislated plan to protect old growth. But it's our greatest chance at this moment in time to finally end the war in the woods. So we're going to continue to work together to mobilize British Columbians and engage with allies both within and outside the conservation movement, so including unions, chambers of commerce, tourism associations, recreation groups, etc., to build a broad-based movement of support for old growth protection. We have this unique opportunity right now to redefine our relationship with the natural world, and in fact, our survival depends on it. In BC, that means protecting old growth forests for the sake of climate, wildlife, tourism, First Nations cultures, and clean water. It means supporting First Nations economic diversification, land use planning, and Indigenous protected areas. And it means diversifying our forest-based communities and investing in value-added second growth forestry. We're going to be ramping up the pressure to get moratoria on old growth hotspots, to implement ecosystem-based management, and support Indigenous protected and conserved areas. Time is really running out for ancient forests, which are some of the grandest on earth right here in BC. Sadly, much of the landscape is starting to look more and more like this, and old growth is getting more and more scarce. But there is still hope, and as you heard, we have solutions for our forests, our climate, our communities, for our economy, and for First Nations that are entirely possible. So I want to also just mention how you can get involved and support our work. So there are a number of ways that I would recommend. You can follow us online and share share information. You can gather petitions and write letters. One of the best things that you can possibly do is to meet with your MLA. They are your representative in the legislature. You can go and sit down with them. You do not need to be a forestry expert or an old growth expert to do this. Tell them why you believe that old growth forests should be protected, and tell them we need a science-based plan in order to get there. Obviously, coming out to events like this tonight is a fantastic way to support the movement. You can also donate. And please submit your feedback to the old growth panel that the government is convening this fall. We're going to have information, tons of information online once that happens. Please participate in this process. It is an excellent opportunity for us to make our voices heard. So I'm actually going to give you an opportunity right now to take action. So we've got some information available for you. If any of you are on Twitter, I would invite you at any point for the rest of the evening to hop on Twitter. We have Twitter handles for Doug Donaldson, the Forestry Minister, Premier John Horgan, and the Environment Minister George Heyman there. We've got Doug Donaldson's office phone number there, and we have a link to our Send a Message page on our website. So there's 3 actions there, or 3 ways that you can take action, and we have a few key asks right there. So to number 1, halt logging in old growth forest hotspots. We need to protect the very best that remains. 2, to develop a science-based old growth plan, support Indigenous protected areas, and ensure sustainable old growth industry. So if you're able to do that right now at some point before the end of the night, that's one tangible, real way that you can take action. And if you're interested to learn more, please come and find us at the end of the evening, and we'd be happy to answer any questions and talk to you about how you can get involved. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm going to hand it back to Tira.
Great. So we're going to open up for a question and answer session. So if you have anything on your mind you'd like to ask, now is going to be the time. We'll welcome our speakers back up on stage. And just a friendly reminder, when you are speaking, just put your hand up. I'll come over and we'll capture your question in the microphone so everybody watching online can hear as well. Okay? So. All right, well, why don't we start with a question from the live stream here.
So our question from the live stream audience, first of all, is, does the authority of BC timber sales need to be reviewed in this time of the climate emergency where every tree standing matters? Where is the line drawn between economics and responsible stewardship?
That's quite a question. Oh, sorry. Sorry, that's quite a question. BC timber sales, I mean, the way there is an incredible opportunity for BC timber sales to set an example to not only to industry but to the rest of the world that BC knows how to manage forests sustainably. BC timber sales could be the method or the vehicle through which the BC government implements modern forest management and conservation solutions, but instead it's one of the worst offenders of old growth logging in British Columbia. How it can be...
Government just direct them to that.
Yeah.
I could just add, sorry, I seem to have trapped my microphone here. Just add briefly, I think the climate emergency provides us with an opportunity to examine all aspects of forest management in British Columbia. In fact, it practically demands it. And as Andrea mentioned in her presentation, there's all sorts of, we can treat all sorts of emergencies right now as an opportunity to re-examine how we manage our forests. BC timber sales is one component of that, certainly not the only component, but when we made our presentations to the minister and his associates, I think we had assumed that this was what's sometimes referred to as the low-hanging fruit. There are lots of things that are really embedded in forest management in the province that are going to take a little while to turn around. But the province can turn around tomorrow and direct BC timber sales to do things differently. So I think everything needs to be re-examined, but the role of BC timber sales should be right up near the front, and it's certainly going to be one of the easiest to deal with.
Just add the Indigenous perspective to that as well. Recall the map that I put up in all of the brown timber supply areas and tree farm license areas. BC Timber Sales has access to volume within those areas, and access is for them is predicated based on market value and so on and so forth. But their ability to come into our home territories and harvest, we know, can happen without appropriate measures of consultation and respect and recognition for our rights as Indigenous people to have access and benefit to that land base. And so from an Indigenous rights perspective, and as we know the pendulum swinging very heavily in favor of Indigenous rights around the world after the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that there should be a review based on that fact as well, in addition to the climate crisis.
Great. We have a question just over here.
Hi. I'm not clear why the government would want to export raw logs instead of processing them in BC and creating more jobs. Can somebody explain that to me, please?
I think oftentimes the decision that government makes are the decisions that they're encouraged to by the companies. And so if the companies can make more money by exporting the logs unprocessed, then they'll encourage the government to let them do so. And I think it doesn't help that the biggest supporters of the current government during their election campaign were the United Steelworkers, which is the union that represents most of the unionized loggers on the coast. So I think it's not something that's necessarily done, it's not something that's done in the best interests of the people of British Columbia who own most of the resource, but it's something that benefits the companies.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much for great presentations. Just as a preamble, I went to a climate modeling session last week with the center at UVic, which is one of the dominant centers in the world on climate change modeling. They've just developed a new model they released about 2 months ago. It's called a CAN something or other 5, and it's absolutely frightening. They're by 2100, their projections are 5 to 8 degrees. They've checked this model several times. They ran it over 50 times trying to find errors in it. They checked with other climate modeling labs around the world. There's about a dozen of them, and only to find out that they're getting the same results. And it's because of the forcing that is coming from the feedback loops in large measure, especially methane release in northern climates. I was just up kayaking in both the New Chatlets and the New Chatlets, sorry, and the Quatsino area, and I was just really surprised to see the extent of logging that's still going on the mountainsides up there. You can't look in any direction and not see massive clear cuts and evidence of relatively recent ones from 10, 15 years ago and 5 years ago. The question I have is, with respect to taking down trees that are 300, 500 years old growth forest, what is the carbon footprint of one of them compared to a young forest or even to seedlings? How many seedlings does it take? How many years does it take to match the carbon sequestration of one, say, 400-year-old tree?
Sure. There's been a lot of research looking at the carbon effects of logging old growth forests. And part of that comes from something that was written in a number of textbooks, that you can actually remove more carbon from the air by logging the over-mature, decadent old growth forests and replacing them with vigorous young forests. And so in terms of a carbon strategy, your best bet was to log all of the old growth forests as soon as possible. And what all of the recent research has demonstrated very clearly is that one of the most important effects is simply the volumes of carbon that are stored in the old growth forest stands. As was mentioned earlier tonight, these stands contain more carbon. Old growth forests in the Pacific Northwest contain more carbon than any other ecosystem on Earth that's been measured. And they photosynthesize and capture large amounts of carbon, but they also respire more than a younger forest. So the net effect of logging old growth forests in every single example that's ever been measured in Western North America has been negative. There's a huge body of scientific literature that shows that perhaps over 120 or 140 years, those stands might begin to approach the amounts of carbon that were being pulled net out of the air in the old growth forests. But in the interim, you've put back into the atmosphere all of that carbon that was stored in the old growth forest. So it's the net effect of logging old growth forests is always going to be to put more carbon back into the atmosphere. Every single research project has shown that. And I think a lot of people now are starting to recognize, and even in the federal election campaign, we hear it, the only truly effective way that we know of to pull carbon out of the air and use that to reduce global carbon dioxide levels is with plants. And most effective plants are trees. So I think you can make a very strong case for old growth forests in terms of maintaining that carbon budget, and certainly that's something that the Ahousaht have included in their planning process, and the Tlaoquiat as well, I think.
There's a short phrase to describe that, and last year the Nature Conservancy commissioned a report along with other partners globally, the phrase natural climate solutions, that our greatest resource in the face of climate crisis is to in fact protect and preserve areas of significance. Those are our natural climate solutions, our greatest allies in this fight.
It's also interesting to note, sorry, I was just riffing on what Tyson has to say here, that in the coastal temperate rainforest on the coast of British Columbia, the further north you go, the more important the wetland ecosystems are. And that's true in Clayoquot Sound as well. And we saw some photos of some of those bog ecosystems earlier tonight. And some of those ecosystems contain immense amounts of carbon in meters and meters of peat that are stored underneath them.
We'll take one from the live stream. What is the procedure to protect culturally modified trees on private lands? Is there one?
It depends on the nature of the private land. If it's private managed forest land, then the private managed forest land regulations apply to it. And the protection around a number of different resource values is nowhere near as strong as what it is over the Crown land base. But I believe there is some minor protection for culturally modified trees on private managed forest land. It's certainly not what you see on publicly managed forest land, and what you see on publicly managed forest land isn't adequate. So it would be even less adequate than what you see over the public land base.
Thank you very much for those presentations. They were beautiful. When I listen and when I've looked at the website, I see tremendous respect and an effort to work with communities, to work with industry, to work with community associations, and to use a lot of petitions, a lot of calling, tweeting. I worry that the government is becoming basically immune to that sort of an approach. And at a meeting or a talk the other day by a gentleman from Extinction Rebellion, he said political change does not come until the government is uncomfortable. And the processes all here do not make the government uncomfortable. They can go through with their normal political process, which is to talk and log. Is there a place for civil disobedience similar to the old days where we sat at Clackwood Sound on the Kennedy Bridge? Do we need something like that to wake the government up that it has to happen now, not a year down the road, 2 years down the road?
So civil disobedience has been an effective tactic in the past, as you mentioned, in Clackwood Sound, in places like the Walbrand Valley, and may at some point in the future, under the right leadership, be effective as well. What we're trying to do, though, is to build a massive groundswell and a broad space movement as we can, which is a new approach and something that is still growing. And I think that by moving beyond the standard base of environmental support and engaging with groups like chambers of commerce, like unions, like faith groups, you can truly affect the vote, which is what politicians are most worried about. And if they're worried about losing power because they're not going to receive your vote, and you have an educated and active citizenry that is out there willing to put their vote on the line, then we can really affect change. All those things are different tools in the toolbox, and what our organization focuses on is reaching that broad demographic, and that's what we'll continue to focus on in the future.
That's not to say that there won't be opportunities for civil disobedience and for direct action. What happens in the next couple of years with this government will be decisive. How serious their old growth strategy ends up being, it'll be an interesting couple of years to really figure out how far they're willing to go. But our organization, as TJ said, does work on building a broad-based movement. But if the time comes where civil disobedience, where British Columbians feel that is the most appropriate step to take, then we can support those efforts.
I'm not with the Ancient Forest Alliance, so I don't have to speak for them. I think you're bang on. And I say that because I think if you look at the last decade, or let's say the last 2 decades on Vancouver Island, I'd be surprised if there's 5 hectares of old growth that's been protected in 20 years. Despite all of the excellent efforts of these good people. And I include their great victory at Avatar Grove because that's in an old growth management area. That's not in a protected area. Okay, as TJ and Andrea are well aware. And anytime you get into a situation where you see such a huge groundswell from so many different groups pressing the government for 2 decades with no changes at all, you have to, first of all, say, are our tactics effective in the end? And B, how frustrated are people going to get before they turn to something else?
Hi, thanks very much for your wonderful presentation. I'd like to come at this from a little much more ignorant end of things. I fail to understand the market value of an old growth tree over something that is much younger. And I'll tell you what I'm seeing. The younger trees are intact all the way through the diameter of the tree. They're straight. They sit on a truck better. They sit in a ship better. They travel. They're lighter to carry. And then you showed us a picture of cedar old growth tree that had just been felled. It was fissured all the way around it, deeply fissured. It was hollow in the center, ginormous to get out of there. What is the attraction from a logging point of view of an old growth tree over a younger one?
Well,
it's also burled all over the place, yeah.
Sure, I can answer that to some extent. I'm certain that Tyson will have something to say about that. And in part, one of the things that I think we'll both address is the quality of size. So if you go to somewhere like the Haida Heritage Center in Skidegate, and you look at the beautiful large cedar planks that have been used to line the walls on it. You'll never get those from a second growth forest. You'll never get that amount of clear wood, of knot-free wood from it, and you won't have the tight grain that we see on a lot of the old growth forest wood. The wood from old growth forests is quite different in strength and form and character from the wood in second growth forests. Having said that, I would like to follow up on your thought there that we grow beautiful Douglas fir and western red cedar on Vancouver Island in our second growth forests faster than just about any place on the globe. And it speaks to the sort of social and economic benefits that we could derive from a properly supported and run second growth forest industry on Vancouver Island. I'm a strong proponent for managing second growth to provide employment and revenue for the communities and the people on Vancouver Island. So the second growth forest wood is wonderful. The old growth forest wood contains a number of qualities that we don't find in the second growth forests. Simply because the second growth forests are growing much more quickly, the growth rings are further apart, so the wood is not as strong. You don't get the percentage of clear wood, you don't get the really big pieces. But there's ways around most of that.
Thank you.
I'll also add that there are some companies that are coming up with some pretty innovative solutions by thermally treating and doing different types of engineering to emulate the characteristics of old growth wood made from second growth trees, so from different types of pine that give you a lot of the rot resistance that you find in cedar. So there are alternatives out there, and we need to support those.
Could I just add that there's an economic laziness factor as well, just to talk about the practicality of it. It's easier and less effort to go in and get old growth than it is to go in and get second growth for your return. Not just for the value of the tree, but for the volume of the harvest. You take a much smaller area of old growth, which requires less engineering, less equipment, perhaps, et cetera, to produce a higher return for yourself. So there's also a laziness factor to it, in my opinion.
Okay, we got time for a few more questions. We've got one here. How do you keep track of all of the logging going on? How do you know where they are going in and destroying the old growth?
Are you a spy? How many secrets do I divulge? So yeah, how do you keep track of where the logging is happening? There's a bunch of different ways that we do that. One is through satellite mapping tools that are online that can give you month-to-month and even daily imagery to track where logging is happening. There's also an online tool called IMAP BC that is all publicly available information on there. You can check on different layers to see pending cut blocks, active cut blocks, pending roads, old growth management areas. It really allows you to see all the aspects of the landscape, which areas are protected, unprotected, and at risk. But there's no substitute for actually being out there on the ground and exploring these areas. So that's a huge part of what I think makes Ancient Forest Alliance unique, is our efforts to continually be out there, driving back roads, hiking into these really rugged areas, and often finding signs of engineering or logging plans before they show up on programs like IMAP. We'll find road location ribbon and falling boundary tape, and then to take the photos and the videos and bring them back to share them at events like this and on social media and with traditional news media, providing them with footage of the logging that's taking place in places like the Namint Valley, because often it's happening in really remote and hard to reach regions of Vancouver Island and British Columbia. So it's out of sight, out of mind. You might just see a truck driving down the highway with like one giant log on the back. You think, where is that coming from? Well, it's probably really hard to get to. 2 or 3 hours down a road in the middle of nowhere. And that's why we try to bring back these pictures to share with people and keep you all in the loop.
That's where partnerships come in as well, right? Indigenous people's partnerships with NGO groups and so on and so forth, where we can work with one another and collaborate on understanding what's actually happening. There's a lot of proposals, there's a lot of referrals that are happening every day that we might not be aware of or get word of late until things have actually started happening. And so getting our people back out into the territories, fulfilling our responsibility to steward our lands and waters, and getting support to do just that, our guardian programs and et cetera, is where we can start to accelerate our awareness of what's going on and be actively managing that more effectively.
I'll also just add, that's why we really need a broad, sweeping science-based plan to protect endangered old growth, because it's just too hard to be everywhere at once and be the kind of forest police with a green light on the roof. Like it's just, BC is a vast area, and often it's just kind of me there on the computer trying to keep track of this, and companies have hundreds of people working for them and all sorts of technology like LiDAR, where they're scanning the forest and they know exactly where the best timber is, and we're just trying to, it's like a cat and mouse game. We're just chasing and trying to keep up with where they're, what they're going after. So it's difficult to fight place by place by place, and we'll always highlight these hot spots that are in need of protection. But that's why you need that science-based plan that encapsulates all the areas that we don't know about and that we might not ever get to.
I'll also add that before the implementation of the Forest and Range Practices Act, which is the legislation that and regulations that govern most of forestry in British Columbia right now, there were much more stringent requirements for companies to sit down at community meetings and say, this is where we're going each year. This is where the road will go each year. These are the proposed cut blocks each year. Under the Forest and Range Practices Act, a lot of those requirements were withdrawn. And so there was less requirement for community meetings, and certainly a lot less requirement for these sorts of specificity about this is where we're going to be putting roads these years. And the government, one of the things they've said about revisions to the Forest and Range Practices Act is they're going to return some of that transparency, which means that there will be less chasing companies to try and figure out where they're going, and hopefully more advance notice for communities.
Yeah, check your local newspaper in the bottom right corner of page 7 where it says consultation open for a forest management plan for the next 5 days. See you later.
Well, do you want time for one more? Okay. Is it possible to have an injunction where a certain cut block is approved, for example, in Eden Grove or in Port Renfrew?
By injunction, do you mean a legal challenge to an approved cut block?
I believe so. So the basis would be unethical practices by BC Timber Sales.
Yeah, why don't you give the example?
I was very young at the time, so there might be better people in this room who can speak to this better. And if anybody has that information, please speak up. But there is an existing injunction on Mears Island, for example, and I can't actually speak to how that was achieved, other than how is it in Tla'aque'it First Nations, along with partners, effectively were able to achieve a court injunction. It is still, if you go back to that map, it is still within tree farm license, I believe 57, but there is an active injunction. We need to resolve that injunction at some time, but it is technically possible. How we approach it from an Indigenous perspective is obviously a rights-based approach, strength of title claim. So when the consultation comes down to the First Nation, it's our responsibility to respond and say, we have a strength of claim here, an Indigenous right to this area, and your actions or activities will do potential harm to our right in that particular area. So that's how we aim to respond to it. Of course, of all the First Nations around British Columbia, there are very, very few that actually have the capacity to effectively respond to those types of referrals. But this is the work that we're doing, trying to build that capacity so that we can have those kind of responses.
And I think it's worth noting that the only way that injunction came about was because when the loggers from McMillan Bloedel showed up at Mears Island, the Haida, Tla'aque'it, and supporters were there waiting for them. And it was only after a prolonged standoff that an injunction was put in place. So, it was achieved through some of the mechanisms that were discussed earlier by some of British Columbia's earliest tree huggers from those nations.
So just to add to that quickly, to the question about what makes governments uncomfortable. The implementation of Indigenous rights do make governments uncomfortable. But what I'm here to help do is to make sure it doesn't feel uncomfortable to you all as well, to the public. It can be a big, scary space to explore and understand. And I'm trying to say that we're in this because we share the same values. We're in there trying to achieve some of the same things. And to work together to realize those rights is how we can achieve things just like this. And we can make governments uncomfortable.
And although the Ancient Forest Alliance has never attempted to place an injunction on proposed cup lock, part of the work that we do is just to document these outstanding areas and bring attention to them, and in some cases, bring people to them. That's how Avatar Grove got protected. It was this outstanding grove, and TJ and our former executive director, Ken Wu, took thousands of people out to Avatar Grove to show them around and build a sense of connection to this very special place. And, we've kind of seen that with Eden Grove as well, although there isn't there's a bit of a trail, if you could call it that. But, it starts to become a real PR problem for logging companies to log areas like Eden Grove, like the Central Walbran, because there is so much attention to those areas. So they know that if they wanted to move into those areas, they would be in for a fight.
All right, we'll take one more. Here we are.
Thank you so much for being here and answering our questions. In light of what's happening with the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the First Nations blocking the building of it, or even the consideration of it, is there a way of using the First Nations and the general public's power in politics to go from stopping bad to keeping good, in keeping the forests, stopping the pipelines, and keeping the forests intact?
That's a good question. I mean, it's there are many battles to fight, sadly. At least there is, it's sort of the idea that a rising tide moves all boats, that greater awareness of global climate change, of biodiversity loss, of continued investment in fossil fuel infrastructure, of the destruction of old growth forests, that all these things are connected, And so, so certainly there are opportunities for these various campaigns to complement each other, and opportunities for us to cross the divides of our issues that we work on, and to work together to share knowledge and to support each other, you know, whether it's nations supporting nations and environmental groups supporting each other. But it's difficult because many people will choose their cause and direct their focus and attention to it, and sometimes it's with the ancient forest movement anyway, it's a campaign that's been raging for decades. It's not a flash in the pan project that can incite an enormous amount of support just like that, like Site C, like the Kinder Morgan pipeline, etc. I feel like we have our own particular challenges with this campaign. And I'm waiting and hoping for that pipeline to finally get the nail in the coffin. It's not hopeful, but my dream is that everyone working on that campaign will then join us in the Ancient Forest campaign. But we'll see.
Yeah, I imagine so. So yes, there of course are First Nations who support and oppose all sorts of different resource development projects, and there are mechanisms that that First Nations technically have access to express their opinions and perspectives about how things are developed. Now that of course becomes a challenge because different First Nations might have different perspectives. I think what Andrea was getting at is that there's a systemic issue problem. There's something deeper than just putting a stop to the pipeline or being pro-pipeline, putting a stop to old growth harvest or being pro-old growth harvest. For example, in our territories, we obviously we have a very impoverished community. 100 years of colonialism has left our people with very little to feed ourselves with, and so on, as the salmon stocks continue to decline for reasons that aren't our causing, and so on. Naturally, we want to have access to economic opportunity. And so how we're trying to respond to that is by developing, in partnership with governments, with NGO partners, better practices for all, rather than trying to take a stop or start approach to things, trying to address the kind of underlying systemic issues that are below the waterline, that are deep down in that iceberg. So there isn't any veto power out there for First Nations people, for example. We are consulted as a government, and it depends on our capacity and ability to respond and our interest in that particular proposed project. So there isn't that. And what we're trying to address is that deeper underlying systemic issue of injustice, of equality, of environmental right, and what we predicate our decision making on are, of course, those cultural values in the New Channel territories. I, of course, can't speak for nations along the Trans Mountain Corridor.
And I think I'll just add, I think that's the number one reason why the Ancient Forest Alliance supports things like the concept around conservation financing and money for the sustainable economic development and diversification of not only First Nations communities, but all rural communities, so that they have an option to move away from things like old growth logging should they wish to do so. And that's what we've seen, is that where there is a monetary alternative, the path towards conservation becomes that much easier, and that's what people take. It's just, often you're presented with logging is like the only option sitting in front of you. So the 1.3 billion committed from the federal government is the number one opportunity I think that we see right now to solving a lot of these issues across the province.
Great. Well, with that, we'll conclude the question and answer session for the live stream portion. We'll invite the wonderful speakers to get comfortable on the side, and we're all going to congregate. We'll have a few minutes for everybody to mingle. If you have a few extra questions on the side and you want to just have a conversation, there's space to do that. So big round of applause for our speakers tonight.